Well, hey there, and welcome back to Heimler's History. In this video, we're going to continue looking at Unit 2 of the AP Government Curriculum, specifically the expansion of presidential power over time. Since the time of Franklin Roosevelt, the power and role of the president has grown by roughly 13 or 14 metric buttloads, and we need to figure out how that happened and why. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, well then let's get to it. So in this video, here's our objective. Explain how presidents have interpreted and justified their use of formal and informal powers. Now to begin, let me remind you of what I said in the last video about formal and informal powers of the executive branch. Formal powers are those powers granted to the president explicitly in Article 2 of the Constitution, things like the veto or appointing federal judges. Informal powers are those powers that are not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but that the president exercises nonetheless, things like bargaining and persuasion and executive agreements. Now, all presidents have made use of their formal and informal powers, but over time, the president has used more and more of both powers, and the end result has been a much more powerful executive than we had when the Republic began. Now, let me remind you that this growth of power in the executive branch was one of the chief fears that had anti-federalists pooping their broadcloth britches during the ratification debates of the Constitution. And the answer to those fears was laid down by Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 70, which is one of your required documents. And here I'm just going to give you a summary, and if you want to look at this required document in more depth, I've got a whole video on it. Anyway, in Federalist 70, Hamilton argues for a single executive. Anti-federalists were arguing back that executive power needed to be divided among a few presidents so that the executive branch didn't become, in their own words, the fetus of monarchy. They were worried that if there was only one president, it would be far too likely that said president would consolidate too much power and become a tyrannical turd. Not so, Hamilton argues. He says that a single executive is very much necessary. First, because a single person can act more decisively when required. Second, a single executive will actually be a protection against the expansion of executive power, because if the president tries to grab at power, everybody knows exactly who to blame. And thus, a single executive will be much more inclined to be careful with the power since they will be watched so closely. Now, I happen to think that Hamilton's arguments are pretty sound, but it's also true that presidential power has expanded significantly over time, and that change largely has to do with how the president understands the role. And we actually have illustrations of two opposing interpretations of the executive role, and the first is from President Teddy Roosevelt, who said this: "My view is that every executive officer, and above all every executive officer in high position, was the steward of the people, bound actively and affirmatively to do all he could for the people, and not to content himself with the negative merit of keeping his talents undamaged in a napkin. My belief was that it was not only his right, but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless such an action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws." In other words, Roosevelt is saying that the president ought to act on behalf of the people in every conceivable manner unless it is explicitly restricted by the Constitution. The next president, William Howard Taft, had a different opinion of executive power. He said the true view of the executive functions is, as I conceive it, that the president can exercise no power which cannot be fairly and reasonably traced to some specific grant of power or justly implied and included within such express grant as proper and necessary to its exercise. In other words, Taft argued for a much more restricted understanding of executive power. Roosevelt said, do anything as long as it's not explicitly forbidden by the Constitution. But Taft said, do nothing unless it is explicitly granted in the Constitution. And over the course of American history, we can see how those two perspectives were adopted by different presidents. Starting with George Washington, we can see that his conception of executive power was basically to defer to Congress, which was the people's branch. But then a huge shift in that role came with the presidency of Andrew Jackson. He believed himself to be the representative of the people and therefore had a mandate to carry out their will. Now think about that for just a second. Constitutionally, it's Congress that represents the people's will, but Jackson took that mantle upon himself. And you can see this change based solely on the number of vetoes enacted by Jackson. For comparison, Washington vetoed 2 bills, John Adams 0, Thomas Jefferson 0, and then Jackson vetoed 12 bills. So Jackson certainly expanded executive power to match his conception of the role. Then executive power was further expanded under the administration of Abraham Lincoln, although he is generally forgiven for that since, he had a civil war to fight. He assumed executive powers to save the Union and to emancipate the enslaved population of the Confederacy. Additionally, he suspended the constitutional right of habeas corpus, which means that people could be arrested without a proper trial. Now that's a heinous thing, but again, he's generally forgiven for it since, Civil War. But forgiven or not, Lincoln certainly expanded the power glove into which the presidential hand fit. But that glove would expand beyond all proportion in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. Elected during the Great Depression, Roosevelt made broad use of his executive powers in order to pass his New Deal legislation aimed at rescuing Americans from their economic suffering. And to this end, he was able to get scores of New Deal policies passed. He created new agencies, he spent buttloads of federal money to put people to work, and he made use of the veto more than any other president before him, 635 times, to which I say, Dang. Additionally, the man was elected no less than 4 times, breaking the 2-term tradition set by Washington. And he took his power so far that he tried to push out Supreme Court judges who disagreed with him and replace them with judges friendly to his policies. Now, that didn't work, but he tried nonetheless. And the thing is, despite Roosevelt being the poster boy for the anti-federalist fears of a tyrannical executive, he kind of proves Hamilton's point in Federalist 70. In the 1930s, the nation was in crisis, and FDR came in and got to work quick, fast, in a hurry to handle it. And whether you agree or disagree with Roosevelt's New Deal policies, nobody can disagree that he was an energetic executive. Now, since FDR's presidency, presidential power has expanded and contracted somewhat, but it has never gone back to the smaller scope of power that we had in a president like Washington. And I think it's kind of funny how today Republicans and Democrats argue about how big or small the government should be. After FDR, the government was big. Full stop, no equivocation. What they're really arguing about today is whether there should be a smaller big government or a bigger big government. Anyway, despite this almost constant growth in the power of the presidential role, there are some checks on that power that you should know. Just because the president has become more powerful doesn't mean the president is immune to the checks and balances of other branches. Case in point, President Donald Trump was impeached twice during his 4 years in office, joining the ranks of 2 other presidents who had been impeached, Bill Clinton and Andrew Johnson. Now, Trump was not removed from office, but the impeachment served as a reminder that the president is not all-powerful. Additionally, another check you should know is that after Roosevelt's 4 terms in office, we ratified a new amendment, namely the 22nd Amendment, which limited the president to 2 terms. Okay, that's what you need to know about Unit 2, Topic 6 of the AP Government Curriculum. You can click right here and grab a review packet, which will help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I myself am invested with precisely 0 executive power, but if you want me to keep making these videos, then you can let me know that by subscribing. Heimler out.